Well, greetings, Ford Scholars. I wish I could be with you in person, but I can't, because it's the time of the Great Plague. And I've been driven to making videos to get my messages about Plato across. So, let's begin. Tonight I want to briefly talk about Plato's dialogue, usually called the Symposium, but more accurately perhaps translated as the drinking party, and then talk in more detail about Socrates and Plato. Now, I've always been fascinated with the Symposium. It's the very first thing I ever read when I was a first semester student in college in an honors program at LSU about 46 years ago. You could almost say that reading it as a first-year student has led to what I'm doing now, being a philosophy professor talking to you about the Symposium. It fully possessed my imagination, and I've never stopped thinking about what it says. Now, the Symposium is thought to have been composed around 385 BCE, but it is set 20 to 30 years earlier, in 416 BCE. Remember, it's a play that Plato wrote, and in the play he has people remembering something that happened many years ago. Right? And what they're remembering is a party where people gave speeches about eros, about erotic love, given in honor of Agathon, who was a dramatic poet who had just won a contest at the great winter festival in Athens. Now, a drinking party or symposium was a regular institution in Athens. It reflected the fact that the ancient Greeks didn't like to drink alone. They thought that those who drank alone were disgraceful. So they liked to drink in a communal setting with a certain order and rule. It could include wine, perfume, songs, music, food, dancing, games, conversations, and speeches. It would look to us like a meeting with a changeable agenda, and was at once a spectacle and performance, aimed at cultivating enjoyment above all else and appealing to all the senses, hearing, taste, touch, smell, sight, and the intellect, yet with a certain religious flavor to it as well, for it was dedicated to the god Dionysius, the god of the party, the god of wine. Now, in the banquet room, everyone was positioned to see all the others, and they were on the same level to facilitate conversation. There would be couches along the four walls, and nothing would take place behind them. So the space was constructed to ensure reciprocity, with each drinker with another beside him on the couch in front of them. As you can see, there would be low tables in front of the couches to set their wine or food on. There would be torches set about. There would be women playing flutes. There would be people to serve the food and wine. And in the center would be what was called a crater, a large jug-like bowl of wine from which the wine would be dipped out in pitchers or jugs and poured into cups. Right? And here you can see a reconstruction of what the couches and tables looked like. And there's the crater, and there's the woman playing flutes, the famous two-piped flutes, right? And the symposium was ideally what was called a komos, a celebration ultimately presided over by the god of wine. And the participants were called komastes, revelers, sacred partygoers. And one person would be appointed the damarchos, the master of the revels, the party master. Symbolically, the wine itself would equal Dionysius, and the partygoers, his followers or satyrs, the goat-like creatures, half men, half goat, who attend to him. And it would be dedicated to oinos kai aletheia, wine and truth, or the Latin translation, in vino veritas. There would also sometimes be an altar lodged in the ground at the center as well, with perhaps a statue of a satyr, the half-beast, half-human attendants of Dionysius with pointed ears and horses' tails, almost always portrayed with a huge erect penis as a symbol of excess and passion. And though satyrs are symbols of excess, the main idea was to celebrate as human beings and allow the wine to test you and show who you really are. Oinos kai aletheia, and vino veritas. The characters in the dialogue were well known to people in Athens as historical and sometimes still contemporary figures. We are most familiar with Aristophanes because of his still existing plays, and Alcibiades, the great traitor hero who played such a part in the history of imperial Athens. At the time of the party, Alcibiades would have been in his early 30s and at the height of his popularity. Sometime after this party, he was chosen to lead the expedition to Sicily, whose loss ultimately led to the defeat of Athens by the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War. And so he ended up being a great traitor. To say Alcibiades, at the time the symposium was written, was like saying something like Benedict Arnold, about 40 years after the Revolutionary War. Because the night before the expedition left, what are called the Hermae, statues representing the face and genitals of Hermes, were mutilated. These statues were guardian figures outside everyone's home. Think of them like little statues of the Virgin Mary outside a Catholic's house, say, or like a statue of the Buddha in a Buddhist garden. Well, anyway, these little statues were desecrated, and popular sentiment was that Alcibiades had done this because he was always pulling pranks and doing crazy things. And he was recalled to Athens in order to be executed. But he defected to Sparta and greatly helped them in their defeat of Athens. Now, the poet Agathon is also mentioned in the historical records, though none of his plays have survived. Shortly after the party, he left Athens to be a court poet to a tyrant named Archelaus. Eryximachus was a famous physician at the time. He and Phaedrus were also implicated in the desecration of the little religious statues. They went around knocking their little rock penises off. Not a good thing to do, right? There's no mention of others in the historical record independently, though Apollodorus is mentioned in the Apology and the Phaedo, two other dialogues by Plato. So this was a rather notorious bunch. And the framework for the play is extraordinary. It offers us levels of remembrance. Levels of remembrance. Consider how it's framed at the beginning, right? There's this fellow Aristodemus who was at the symposium in 416 BCE, and Socrates was at the symposium in 416 BCE. So apparently, Aristodemus told the story to Phoenix, and he also told the story to Apollodorus. And then Phoenix told the story to, all it says is someone else, and Apollodorus checked the details with Socrates. And now here we have something interesting, because apparently Socrates was such an amazing fellow that any time he gave a talk or gave a speech, people would try to remember them. Sometimes they'd run off and try to write down almost right away what he'd said, and then they'd go check with Socrates to see if it matched up with what he had said, though Socrates himself never wrote anything down. And this was also in what we call an oral culture just transitioning into a literate one. So people in general had what we would call better memories, or they were more practiced at memory. They could hear a speech and then almost recite, almost verbatim, what they'd heard, though they would check, like you have Apollodorus checking Socrates here. Right? Now, Phoenix told the story to someone else, and that someone else gave Glaucon a garbled account and told him Apollodorus had been at the party and knew the story. So Apollodorus then told the story to Glaucon at his request between 401 and 399 BCE. See, Apollodorus told the story to Glaucon. And Apollodorus, who's rehearsed the story, apparently people would try to memorize these accounts, is conversing with a group of friends 2 days after telling the story to Glaucon. They want to hear the story And Apollodorus is going to tell them, just as Aristodemus told him. And now Plato, sometime after 385 BCE, wrote the story about Apollodorus telling the story to a group of friends, as he told it to Glaucon 2 days earlier, having heard it from Aristodemus, who was there, and checked his facts with Socrates, who was also there. Glaucon had prompted Apollodorus to tell them the story because he had a confused account from someone who mistakenly thought Apollodorus had been there, having heard the story from Phoenix, who heard it from Aristodemus. Well, my goodness, what a marvelous framework. What a sort of memory palace of memories within memories within memories. Okay? It makes me think of a movie or a play where someone starts out, I remember when someone told me this, and then the people they're remembering who told them that they remembered when someone told them this, who talked to someone else who remembered they told them that, and now we're all sort of hearing this story. And in this story within a story within a story, we have 7 speeches given, connected by various incidents, interchanges, and comments by Apollodorus as he recites it. We have a speech by Phaedrus, a speech by Pausanias, a speech by Eryximachus, a speech by Aristophanes, a speech by Agathon, a speech by Socrates, and finally a speech by Alcibiades. And what is at issue is the nature of eros, of erotic love. And in these speeches, the speakers do not agree with each other, presenting differing points of view. Now, as you read, pay attention to how the speeches lay the groundwork for the final 2 speakers, Socrates and Alcibiades. It's an obvious point in the first speeches that eros can be understood as sexual desire, which can have many different effects and take many different forms, some of them better than others. The point is also raised in the earlier speeches that eros might have more meaning than simple sexual desire, so that it might be a clue to something more profound. For example, Eryximachus connects eros with the basic workings of the cosmos, while Aristophanes connects it with the most basic needs of being human and the key to human happiness in his famous story of the Circle People, which is really Plato's story of the Circle People, put in Aristophanes' lips, remember, because this is a play by Plato. Now, this gradual movement toward understanding the deeper implications of sexual desire lead up to the speech of Diotima, the priestess, who gives a speech within Socrates' speech, another level of remembrance, a speech within a dialogue within a speech that Socrates reports. And in this speech, eros is seen as the clue to the ultimate actualization of human potentiality through the understanding of absolute beauty, which is the hidden ultimate object of eros all along, according to Socrates, who is a figure in a play written by Plato. Alcibiades then bursts in and gives his speech, and many agree that what he says offers a final key to what Plato is trying to say. We'll see what you think. Because one thing the dialogue delivers most truly, I think, is an understanding of Socrates and Plato. In the Symposium, we see Plato speaking through the characters and drama of the play. For never forget, it's a play. In this way making plain what Plato thought to be the meaning of Socrates' life. If we think in general about the figure of Socrates and Plato, they always stand together in the imagination of those who think about the origins of Western thought. Together, more than any other 2 people, they seem to define what became known as philosophy, the love of wisdom. As you probably know, Socrates was Plato's teacher, and Plato presented his thought as a development of what Socrates had taught. And together they've haunted the minds of human beings in the ancient world, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, down through the birth of modernity in our time, and finally to me. Yes, Socrates and Plato haunt my mind too, a good haunting by good spirits that sometimes bewitches me and takes me right out of myself. I am haunted by their vision of what it means to think and live and be a human being. And I would like to explain to you why. Now, the first thing to understand is that Socrates was known as the ugliest man in Athens. He had a broad, flat, turned-up nose, protruding pop eyes, thick, fleshy lips, bandy legs, and a big pot belly. He was always saying he planned to dance off. And this was not exactly the standard for physical beauty in classical Greece. If you want, they would have liked, say, someone like the young Brad Pitt, right? If you know who he is. Or just pick whatever young, handsome man you could think of. Some beautiful young man. And they would have loved that and not how Socrates looked. In fact, everyone said he looked like a satyr, the mythical half-beast, half-human divinity that haunted the forest, playing the panpipes. But all kinds of people desired Socrates. All kinds of people loved him, were fascinated by him, and wanted him. And no one loved him more than Plato did. In fact, for Plato, he was clearly the most beautiful man in Athens. And why did people love him? What was it about this ugly old man that fascinated so many people? That fascinates me. I love him too, you know. I'm one of Socrates' lovers. Well, listen to something he once said when he was on trial for his life for the charge of corrupting young people through leading them into philosophy, like he corrupted me, like I'm trying to corrupt you, too. Speaking to his judges and jury on trial for his life, he says, quote, "If you said to me, Socrates, we acquit you, but only on condition that you do not practice philosophy, and if you are caught doing so, you will die, I would say to you, gentlemen of the jury, I am grateful and I am your friend, but I will obey the God rather than you. And as long as I draw breath and am able, I shall not cease to practice philosophy, to exhort you, and in my usual way to point out to any one of you who happen to meet, you're an American. You're an Athenian, a citizen of the greatest place, with the greatest reputation for both knowledge and power. Are you not ashamed of your eagerness to possess as much wealth, reputation, and honors as possible, while you do not care for nor give thought to wisdom or truth, or the best possible state of your soul?" Unquote. The force of Socrates' life was the force of a life devoted to truth and wisdom. Above all else, he loved wisdom. But what exactly does that mean? Socrates is perhaps best known for his claim that he was the wisest man alive because he knew what he did not know, his famous claim of ignorance. Most everybody's heard of that in one form or another, but how many know that there's something he claimed to know? In the play, The Drinking Party, and in several others as well, he claimed to know only one thing, the truth about Eros, the truth about erotic love. And strangely enough, it is the idea of this that will take us to the heart of what it means to be a lover of wisdom, in the heart of the Socratic Platonic philosophy. So at the drinking party, after everyone began to give their speeches, saying how beautiful love was, how perfect, and how full of goodness and delight, love, they would say, was the most beautiful and perfect of all the gods, and endlessly captivating. But when it became time for Socrates to speak, he said something shocking. He said that the first thing he learned about love was that it was not beautiful or perfect. He learned that love was not a god, because gods are perfect and complete, and so they have desire or love for nothing, right? Because they don't need anything. But love, above all, consists in the knowing you don't have what you want and need. Have you ever been in love and desired someone of that full-on kind of intoxicating desire? Then you know what Socrates means, that love wants what it desires, and that means that it lacks what it wants. But gods lack nothing. So love is not a god. Instead, Socrates said, it's something stretched out in between the gods and human. It's not a divinity, yet it's divine. It's not immortal, yet it's undying. It's always needy, yet always being satisfied. For to love is to love something which you need, desire, and want, so that love is always aiming for what it does not have. Socrates also says that love is a particular kind of want or lack. It's a lack of and desire for good things. For no one, Socrates thought, knowingly wants something evil for themselves, by which is meant something that would make them less complete. We have an inborn desire for self-fulfillment and completion, and what draws us on in desire is what completes us and makes us whole. Love naturally desires what will make us more alive and fulfilled in being alive. And since everyone desires this, love is common to all living things. Every living thing is seeking completion. Gods don't have love then. They lack nothing. But humans lack all kinds of good things. Don't you lack good things? And if we're wise, then we know it. If we're wise, we know our lack, and this sets us free to pursue those things that will fill that lack and make us whole. To be human is to be a lover, and to have at the heart of who we are a terrible passion arising from an awareness of our need that nothing around us ever seems to ultimately satisfy. And this is Socrates' wisdom. It's what he spent his life trying to get people to see. Know yourself, he said, in effect to everyone he met. Know what it means to be human. When Socrates claimed to know what he did not know, he was only claiming to know himself as a human being, to know that he was a lover. Socrates knew himself, was fully self-aware, and so was the wisest man alive. In being fully a lover, he was fully conscious of what he lacked, and so had a passion to pursue the truth he could never fully possess. Do you ever ache to know what is real and how you should live, just as you would ache for a beloved, so that you're not satisfied with what satisfies most people? If you ache for wisdom like that, Socrates would say, maybe you could follow that ache to the heart of what it means to be human. Note that in the dialogue, Socrates argues that love is to be identified with the lover and not the beloved. Love is in essence a desire for completion, and it is manifest on one level in the sexual union of animals and humans, in their desire to create life which will live after them. But this desire also leads us to create social order and society itself, and can lead us on to the love of beauty, which first appears as the love of physical beauty, and then moral beauty, and finally to the love of the idea of beauty itself. In this kind of love, we find what is truly lasting and completing us. So for Plato, Eros is a kind of self-motion of the soul, in which it seeks to know the real order of the cosmos, which is not visible to the senses, which notes only particular things, and not their universal aspect, which you can only know with what Plato called the eyes of your mind. The philosopher is thus literally a lover of wisdom, a person who attempts to carry the impulse of Eros beyond its ordinary manifestations in order to see what is true and universal in all of them, to find the one in the many. So philosophy is the attempt to love directly and with awareness that which is being blindly loved in the more ordinary forms of loving. According to Socrates, the existing individual, which means you and me, here and now, we are fundamentally incomplete, and we can only realize ourselves through developing an awareness of that incompleteness, with a corresponding passion to overcome that incompleteness and make ourselves whole. But if you don't know what you lack and you need, if you don't know what you don't know, well then, there you'll sit, poor lump, for the rest of your days, a poor lump who never knows who they are, who never knows that you're a lover. And there's something curious about knowing what you don't know, like Socrates did. How could you know you had no knowledge if you couldn't recognize knowledge when you came across it? Think about it. You would have to in some sense know what knowledge is to know when you were lacking it. And Socrates thought that the possibility to recognize knowledge was in all of us, and devoted himself to waking people up to that recognition. But only the person involved can do this and recognize that knowledge. You have to know things for yourself. Think how ridiculous it would be for me to claim I could know something for you. My children across the years often seem to wish I could know things for them, particularly in dealing with their mathematics homework. Know this for me, Dad, but I could just as well eat something for you. Here, let me eat your lunch for you. Let me know your math for you. And maybe you want me to kiss your girlfriend or your boyfriend for you, too. Some things you just have to do for yourself, or it won't be satisfying at all. So Socrates practiced what he called in Greek the olinkos, the examination, the trial, the test, through question and answer, trying to wake people up to the requirements of knowledge. And because a person can only have knowledge for themselves, Socrates couldn't just give anyone the answers, because the only real answer is one you give yourself. So he would proceed in a way in which the truth claims of his interlocutors would be tested and refined, logical inconsistencies revealed, and to look for what he called the idea of a thing, the intelligible shape or form, pointed at in the verbal form of a definition. Now, in Greek originally, the word ideia, or eidos, usually translated as idea, originally simply meant the visible shape or form of a thing. So we could say this sheet of paper here has a rectangular idea, a rectangular eidos, just simply the visible shape or form. And then it began to take on the meaning of the intellectual shape or form of a thing. So we could say the intellectual shape or form of water could be expressed as H2O, for example. And that would give us what they said in Greek was the TSD, the what it is of a thing, the reality of a thing, the idea of it. So for Socrates, he thinks of the characteristic shape a thing has to the ideas of the mind, by which we could always recognize it in whatever particular context we find it in, right? Behind that is the idea, for example, of what is the reality of water? And a chemist, say, could test a water sample, right? And find that it fit the pattern of what water is, the pattern which we now know to be H2O. And if it fits that pattern, if it has that form, then it is water. And that's the reality of water. And then we would know we had a real sample of water. And this, Socrates thought, we would call the ousia, the beingness, the reality of the thing. And the worst that could happen in practicing the olinkos, in being examined and examining yourself, is to come to see that you have no idea. You do not know what something is. And in this way, you gain a real sense of what it is you lack. And knowing your lack, you're free to look for it. In Plato's dialogues, then, Socrates is presented as going around in search of these ideas, trying to see what can or cannot be put into words and given a rational account. He would then ask people to define, people he ran into, such key terms in his culture as courage, wisdom, piety, virtue, justice, and love. And consider, if you can show people they do not know what these things are, that they have no real idea of them, in the process you will also come to show them what it would mean to know them, or to know anything at all. Show people what they lack, show them their ignorance, and they might just begin to develop a real sense of what they lack and need. And here something is being developed that is absolutely amazing in terms of what it means to be human. But we take it so much for granted that we can't even see it for what it is. We cover over the wonder of it by saying that what Socrates was doing was looking for a definition. A definition, is that it all? Right? But he was looking for knowledge. He was looking for the universal. He was looking for the pattern of something by which we could recognize anything, no matter what circumstance we found ourselves in. And this is something so astonishing that we take for granted, because all of us have in us an innate ability to recognize the universal. to recognize things by their intellectual shape or pattern across many different contexts and to put it into words. But this ability was born in us at such an early age that we've forgotten how astonishing it is, right? That when a child looks at a dog, right, at first they don't know what that is, and you tell them dog, and then later you run across another dog, and you point it in and you say dog. But then the child really doesn't understand. They'll see a bird and point at it and say dog, or they'll look at a tree and say dog. They don't know that it means just this thing wherever you run across it as having that pattern. And then comes the moment when the child can recognize a dog, and they'll say, well, that's a dog, and that's a dog, and that's not a dog, it's a cat. And that seems so simple to us, but it's not. And we've forgotten what an amazing thing it is to have this ability. Now, there was a person who lived at the turn of the 20th century and up until about the middle of the 20th century named Helen Keller. And Helen Keller can help us remember how astonishing it is to recognize these universal patterns and to be able to speak about them. Because Helen suffered what we now think is rheumatic fever when she was a child, a baby, and as she grew up, she didn't cross that threshold that all of us cross so early that we forget when we begin to be able to tell that this is a dog and this is a dog and this is not a dog and this is like this and this is not like that. Right? She had this happen to her when she was 7 years old, when a teacher came to her. At this time, the deaf and blind children were sort of first beginning to be treated in what we would call a scientific kind of way. And what is called finger speech was developed, where you make letters with your fingers because they couldn't see, they couldn't hear, right? You make letters with your fingers to spell. And in this way, you could begin to go through the same process that you went through with children. But Helen was 7 when this happened to her. And she remembers something all of us forget, right? This marvelous thing. So we're going to read a chapter from her book. It's a short one, don't worry. I'm going to put it up on the screen and we can read through it together. And we can think about Helen Keller experiencing this thing we've all experienced, which she calls learning that everything has a name, but what Socrates or Plato would have called recognizing the universal, our first taste of knowledge. The most important day I remember in all my life is the one in which my teacher, Anne Mansfield Sullivan, came to me. I'm filled with wonder when I consider the immeasurable contrast between the two lives which it connects. It was the 3rd of March, 1887, 3 months before I was 7 years old. On the afternoon of that eventful day, I stood on the porch, dumb, expectant. I guessed vaguely from my mother's signs and from the hurrying to and fro in the house that something unusual was about to happen. So I went to the door and waited on the steps. The afternoon sun penetrated the mass of honeysuckle that covered the porch and fell on my upturned face. My fingers lingered almost unconsciously on the familiar leaves and blossoms which had just come forth to greet the sweet southern spring. I did not know what the future held of marvel or surprise for me. Anger and bitterness had preyed upon me continually for weeks, and a deep languor had succeeded this passionate struggle. Have you ever been at sea in a dense fog, when it seemed as if a tangible white darkness shut you in, and the great ship, tense and anxious, groped her way toward the shore with plummet and sounding line, and you waited with beating heart for something to happen? I was like that ship before my education began, only I was without compass or sounding line, and had no way of knowing how near the harbor was. Light, give me light, was the wordless cry of my soul, and the light of love shone on me in that very hour. I felt approaching footsteps. I stretched out my hand, as I supposed, to my mother. Someone took it, and I was caught up and held close in the arms of her who had come to reveal all things to me, and, more than all things else, to love me. The morning after my teacher came, she led me into her room and gave me a doll. The little blind children at the Perkins Institution had sent it, and Laura Bridgman had dressed it, but I did not know this until afterward. When I had played with it a little while, Miss Sullivan slowly spelled into my hand the word D-O-L-L. I was at once interested in this finger play and tried to imitate it. When I finally succeeded in making the letters correctly, I was flushed with childish pleasure and pride. Running downstairs to my mother, I held up my hand and made the letters for doll. I did not know that I was spelling a word, or even that words existed. I was simply making my fingers go in monkey-like imitation. In the days that followed, I learned to spell in this uncomprehending way a great many words, among them pin, hat, cup, and a few verbs like to sit, stand, and walk. But my teacher had been with me several weeks before I understood that everything has a name. One day, while I was playing with my new doll, Miss Sullivan put my big rag doll into my lap also, spelled D-O-L-L, and tried to make me understand that D-O-L-L applied to both. Earlier in the day, we had a tussle over the words M-U-G and W-A-T-E-R. Miss Sullivan had tried to impress it upon me that M-U-G is mug and that W-A-T-E-R is water. But I persisted in confounding the two. In despair, she had dropped the subject for the time, only to renew it at the first opportunity. I became impatient at her repeated attempts, and seizing the new doll, I dashed it upon the floor. I was keenly delighted when I felt the fragments of the broken doll at my feet. Neither sorrow nor regret followed my passionate outburst. I had not loved the doll. In the still dark world in which I lived, there was no strong sentiment or tenderness. I felt my teacher sweep the fragments to one side of the hearth, and I had a sense of satisfaction that the cause of my discomfort was removed. She brought me my hat, and I knew I was going out into the warm sunshine. This thought, if a wordless sensation may be called a thought, made me hop and skip with pleasure. We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. They were barriers still, it is true, but barriers that could be in time swept away. I left the well house eager to learn. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life. That was because I saw everything with the strange new sight that had come to me. On entering the door, I remembered the doll I had broken. I felt my way to the hearth and picked up the pieces. I tried vainly to put them together. Then my eyes filled with tears, for I realized what I had done, and for the first time I felt repentance and sorrow. I learned a great many new words that day. I do not remember what they all were, but I do know that mother, father, sister, and teacher were among them. Words that were to make the world blossom for me, like Aaron's rod with flowers. It would have been difficult to find a happier child than I was, as I lay in my crib at the close of that eventful day, and lived over the joys it had brought me, and for the first time I longed for a new day to come. Now we've all experienced what Helen experienced, but like I said, we've forgotten it. This first instance in which we have knowledge, and we sense what it means to know an idea. We have our first taste of the universal, of a concept. Right? Watch your little brothers and sisters if you have some, or like I've watched my children, or like I've especially enjoyed watching my granddaughter Juniper, who I've known now for 3 years. And I saw her cross this threshold, and it was quite amazing. And I remember a time when she suddenly realized that all these funny different seating things on the back porch were chairs, and she would point at it, and she'd say, "What is it?" And I'd say, "Chair." And then she'd go to this other very different looking chair, and she'd say, "What is it?" And I'd say, "Chair." And she'd laugh. She'd laugh, and she'd point at another one and say, "What is it?" And I'd say, "Chair." And then she'd point at the dog and she'd say, "What is it?" And I'd say, "That's not a chair." And she'd say, "I'm teasing you." She got it. This universal, this idea that we can know things and recognize them, no matter what context we find them in, no matter how different they look, we can look through the differences and see the sameness and how they're the same. And behind this, then, comes the search for a definition, a way to put into words the universal characteristics of a thing. To look for a definition, in Socrates' sense, is to assume that there are certain general characteristics that make a thing what it is, and enable you to tell it apart from all other things. To assume that you will be able to tell what is the same and what is different in the things that you deal with. Think about your breakfast, for example, if you got up earlier enough to have one. All things that we call food share the formal trait, the mental form, as it were, of being nourishing to some living creature or the other. But no particular food, no particular thing is food for every creature. There's breakfast for the sparrow, and breakfast for the crab, and breakfast for the earthworm, and breakfast for the Eckerd student, who in 100 years or so might find themselves being breakfast for the worm. And what nourishes the worm is very different from what nourishes the student. And yet there's a common mark, a common form found in the fact that it nourishes. And to lack this knowledge, and to know that you lack it in some particular instance, like what is courage, right? Like I know water, dog. What is courage? What is wisdom? What is love? Right? Well, to lack knowledge and to know that you lack it is the condition for any possibility of knowledge at all. But this is something you can only do for yourself. Though others can help you and try to lead you out and through, giving hints and so forth, ultimately you must do it for yourself for it to be real knowledge. You must eat your food for yourself to be nourished, or make love to your own lover to fulfill your desire. Otherwise, Socrates says, you only have an opinion and not knowledge at all. Knowledge requires that you be able to grasp the eidos, the idea, its mental shape or form. That's what it means to have knowledge. And this is true in all our daily lives. We are constantly operating in this realm as we act in relation to the things in the world around us and speak to both ourselves and others about them. When we speak and are understood, or understand what others are saying, and even the fact, and especially the fact that we can be mistaken, and maybe we're mostly mistaken, shows us that we must have some sense of what the thing really is. For how else could we come to know we were mistaken if we did not at least have some sense of what it would mean to know the things we are seeking to know? Socrates would love to put this in mythic terms and say that when we learn something, we must be remembering what we in some sense at least already know. That knowledge really comes to us by what he calls recollection. And like no one can remember something for us, so no one can know something for us. No one can teach you an idea. They can only point it out. And then you have to know it for yourself. You have to see it with the idea of your mind, with the eyes of your mind for yourself. If there's a tree behind you, I say turn and look at the tree. I'm seeing the tree, but until you turn and look at it, you don't see the tree. It's the same with an idea. Like the Pythagorean theorem, if you've ever learned that. A teacher could explain it on the board, but you have to understand it for yourself. You have to grasp the explanation and take it into your mind. And this ability to really speak and be understood, and to understand what a thing is, what it means for it to be, is an astonishing thing. In fact, it seems to me it is far more astonishing than if I could levitate off the floor right now and shoot beams of light out of my eyes at you. To speak and be understood. Think of the wonder that reveals. Here we find a sort of everyday mysticism to which our contempt for the ordinary blinds us. The philosophers of Zen Buddhism are very good at pointing out this reality of the wonder and mysticism of everyday life in just this way. Consider an old Zen story attributed to Muju. When Bankai was preaching at Ryuman Temple, a Shinshu priest who believed in salvation through the repetition of the name of the Buddha of Love was jealous of his large audience and wanted to debate with him. Bankai was in the midst of a talk when the priest appeared, but the fellow made such a disturbance that Bankai stopped his discourse and asked about the noise. The founder of our sect, boasted the priest, had such miraculous powers that he held a brush in his hand on one bank of the river. His attendant held up a paper on the other bank, and the teacher wrote the holy name of Amida through the air. Can you do such a wonderful thing? Bankai replied lightly, Perhaps your fox can perform that trick, but that is not the manner of Zen. My miracle is that when I feel hungry, I eat, and when I feel thirsty, I drink. And the Zen Platonist says, my miracle is that when I think, I can have an idea, and I can tell it to you, and you can understand it. So if we reflect on our everyday experiences, and on the ways we talk about them, we might be able to clarify our experiences into an awareness that involves knowing things in their beingness, or as a Zen thinker might put it, in their suchness. Knowing what is real in the world around us, we could then begin to live and act in terms of what is most real. This meant for Plato and Socrates, his teacher, that our everyday words and deeds are like the bottom rungs of a mystical ladder that can lead us to the truth of the wonder and terror of the world around us. It doesn't look very mystical, maybe, if you don't understand what real mysticism means, which involves above all else coming to be aware of what the Taoist philosophers, in a beautiful phrase, called the great ordinary. Think of that, the great ordinary. This is a chair, and this is a chair, and this is a dog, and this is a dog, and this is not a dog, it's a cat, and this is my breakfast, and it's time to eat it. Would you like some breakfast too? The great ordinary. So in what you read in Plato's play, you saw Agathon come to understand that he couldn't have really meant by love what he said he did, that the knowledge hidden in the way he uses his words will force him to realize that love can't be beautiful and divine, but must be a lack, a real need. Recall how Socrates uses Agathon's own words to show him both what he lacks, and in the process allows him, if he wished, to make some new truths of his own. Agathon can come to have knowledge for himself if he wants to, but this will only become possible when he realizes, as he put it, that I really didn't know what I was talking about. This kind of knowledge is hidden in our everyday lives. It's a very practical kind of knowledge that we can only recognize for ourselves through employing, as Socrates puts it in the Republic, all that we are, through both our hearts and our minds, our reason as well as our imagination, cultivating in the lovely words of the ancient Chinese philosopher Mencius, the intelligence of the heart. This is the truth that sets you free. For if truth is something that you have to do, then it will do you no good just to believe something or take somebody else's word for it. It is precisely because no one can have a truth for you, that no one can know something for you, that knowledge sets you free. For if you're shown a truth and then come to know it, you will become liberated in respect to the truth in the very process of coming to know it. Socrates and Plato like to put this in a paradoxical kind of way, that a practitioner of Zen would be pleased with. In the Meno, the question is asked, can human excellence be taught? And the conclusion is reached is that there are no teachers and no learners of human excellence, but only those who remember it for themselves. All good teachers want to show you how to know. And once you know how to know for yourself, once you know how to whip up a lunch and eat it for yourself, well then, you're free. If you can understand that, you can understand Socrates and Plato. You can understand what it means to be a lover of wisdom. Thank you for your kind attention. I hope you have a good evening, a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good middle of the night, wherever your now finds you.